Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to speak to S-3669, the COVID-19 International Response and Recovery Act of 2020. As of this weekend, there are an estimated 10 million confirmed cases of COVID-19 worldwide. More than 2.5 million of those cases are right here in the United States. The disease has claimed over 125,000 American lives. For anyone who questioned why we should care about what happens elsewhere in the world, this pandemic has certainly been, most assuredly, a wake-up call. The virus didn't start here, but it came here, and Americans are now suffering from the effects of an epidemic that shows no signs of stopping. And even if we bring it under control in the United States, in the absence of U.S. leadership for a truly global response, the virus can and will return. We cannot safeguard American lives without one, but we cannot lead or even meaningfully participate in a global response when we don't have a coherent and effective domestic strategy. The President's desperate denial, his refusal to take this pandemic seriously, his seeming inability to care about the health and well-being of all Americans is as shocking as it is dangerous. As opposed to a pandemic response strategy, the White House seems to have a dangerous public relations strategy, focused on perpetuating a false narrative that insists the pandemic is almost over, blames China and the World Health Organization for its own preparedness and response failures, overstates the administration's domestic and international response, and refuses to be candid with Congress and the American people about the consequences of its irresponsible actions. But make no mistake, contrary to what the White House would have us believe, the COVID-19 threat is far from over. As Dr. Anthony Fauci testified, it is a lack of serious response, not as some in the White House would have us believe, more tests, that is leading to skyrocketing case numbers and hospitalization rates we are seeing today. Unfortunately, the haphazardness that has characterized the White House's response at home has also shaped its response abroad. Secretary Pompeo is right. The American people are the most generous on the planet, but that belies this administration's actual response. The reality is that when it comes to discussion about what it is doing to end the pandemic globally, the administration is trumpeting programs it has spent 3 years consistently and aggressively cutting, which explains perfectly why Secretary Pompeo to this day refuses to come before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to defend his proposed FY21 budget. America, the world needs a strategy to end this pandemic, not a PR blitz to cover inaction. The blame game won't help us either. Yet instead of taking care of the business at hand, the administration is channeling its energy towards fault-finding and divisive, racially inflammatory rhetoric. First, the White House tried to say that the U.S. epidemic was the World Health Organization's fault, despite the fact that the U.S. was regularly communicating with and receiving information from the WHO, including through U.S. government employees embedded at the WHO headquarters in Geneva. In May, the administration announced a 30-day plan to review the organization's handling of the pandemic response. But less than 2 weeks after it announced that sham review, the president said he was going to withdraw from the organization. So much for the 30-day review. Next, the administration doubled down on blaming China. The President, the Secretary of State, the Deputy Administrator of USAID have all used racially stigmatizing language to describe COVID-19 in direct contradiction to guidance issued by our own Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And the insistence that the rest of the world agreed to use such language has prevented us from reaching consensus on statements at the G7 and in the UN Security Council, and seriously weakened our standing. If this administration is truly concerned about China's malign intent at the WHO and elsewhere, there is a simple answer: take action. If the U.S. leads, others will follow. If we leave the field open, others like China will step into the vacuum. Isolationist, go-it-alone tactics are not the way to end a pandemic. At a time when the United States should be leading the global response to one of the greatest threats we face in the 21st century, and this pandemic will most certainly not be our last, I have to wonder if instead what we are witnessing is the death of American leadership and the end of American exceptionalism brought about by the inattention and ineptitude of the Trump administration, both here and abroad. Meanwhile, the rest of the world is stepping up and stepping past us. For example, when Chinese President Xi Jinping addressed the World Health Assembly in May, he pledged $2 billion over 2 years to combat COVID-19. Secretary Azar used the opportunity to attack the WHO and cast blame on China for the pandemic. The European Union held a pledging conference on vaccines in May, at which $8.2 billion was raised. The United States was invited to participate, but the White House declined the invitation. Is this what the President means by America first? Well, if this EU consortium comes up with a vaccine before we do, it will mean America last, as we wait for them to share it with us. This approach is not only isolationist, short-sighted, and foolish, it's dangerous. It's clear that the administration response is not keeping the American people safe. And it's just as clear that there are actions we can take to effectively respond to this pandemic and better prepare for future pandemics. Since the administration doesn't seem to have any ideas, Democrats on the Foreign Relations Committee introduced a bill to provide some. S. 3669, the COVID-19 International Response and Recovery Act, or CIRA, presents a clear strategy to confront the ongoing pandemic, and prepare the United States to deal with the next. It compels the Trump administration to constructively engage with other countries, international organizations, and multilateral fora to stop the spread of the coronavirus. Specifically, our bill authorizes an additional $9 billion in funding to fight COVID-19 pandemic through contributions towards vaccine research at the Coalition for Preparedness and Innovations, a contribution to the Global Fund for AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria for its COVID-19 response mechanism, additional funding for emergency overseas humanitarian assistance in response to the pandemic, ensuring that these funds are provided both to the UN for its global response plan as well as directly to NGOs working on the front lines, and a new surge financing authority at the U.S. International Development Finance Corp., the DFC, that will allow the DFC to expedite decisions and make strategic investments quickly to aid in COVID-19 reconstruction efforts. CIRA also puts in place mechanisms to help us prepare for the next pandemic. It requires an annual national intelligence estimate on pandemic threats, and it establishes a White House advisor for global health security to coordinate a whole-of-government U.S. response to global health security emergencies aimed at improving both domestic and international capacity to prevent, respond, and detect epidemic and pandemic threats. It clearly delineates the roles for the State Department, USAID, and the Center for Disease Control and Prevention in responding to pandemic threats. And it directs the U.S. Executive Director to the World Bank to begin negotiations to establish a trust fund at the World Bank designed not to compete with or supplant the World Health Organization, but to work in tandem with the WHO on incentivizing countries to mobilize their own resources for epidemic and pandemic preparedness. Now, my Republican colleague on the Foreign Relations Committee finally did introduce a modest bill in response to the pandemic. In keeping with the Republican effort to pretend the pandemic is over, it completely ignores the current crisis. Instead, it focuses on giving legislative cover to a leaked proposal from the White House that seems to strip essential pandemic response functions from USAID and put them in the State Department, and sets up a structure at the World Bank that would allow the White House to channel funding meant for the WHO into another multilateral mechanism. Colleagues, to say that that approach is inadequate to meet the crisis of the century would be so much of an understatement as to almost be a lie in and of itself. The chairman's legislation completely ignores the current pandemic while setting us up for failure when we are confronted by the next pandemic. We quite simply must do better. Mr. President, more than 700 Americans a day are dying. Neither the finger-pointing, blame game, race-baiting statements linked to the origins of the disease, nor a strategy centered on denial will win the battle against COVID-19. It is painfully apparent that Congress will have to lead in this effort, just as it led domestic relief and recovery efforts. If we fail to develop a proposal that boldly and robustly addresses the current crisis, ensures that we are adequately prepared for the next one, and aids countries around the globe with recovery, we will have failed the American people, fallen painfully short of the legacy created through initiatives such as the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief and the Marshall Plan, to name a few. We must understand, and there's a recent report that came out of a potential swine flu. Well, whether it's that or something else, we have the risk of the next pandemic. Our engagement globally is not just about being a good global citizen, it's about security and health here at home. When we can engage abroad to stop the flow of a virus, then we ultimately achieve the success on behalf of the American people and will lead the world in a better response. That's what we're seeking to do, and we will come back to the floor at the appropriate time to seek to move that legislation.